What do you do when you're 19 years old, homeless, alone, and with nowhere left to go? For Abigail Foster, the answer came from an uncle she'd never even heard of. Just days after aging out of foster care, she received a phone call. It led her to a quiet lakeside cottage that had belonged to her late uncle, a man she'd never met. She expected nothing more than an old house filled with dust and forgotten memories. Instead, she uncovered a hidden fortune and a secret that had been waiting nearly 20 years to be discovered. Stay with me, because before this story ends, you'll understand why one forgotten letter became more valuable than everything hidden inside that little cottage. Her name was Abigail Foster, and until the autumn she turned 19, she believed no one had ever come looking for her. Children who grow up in foster care learn certain lessons far too early. How to fit their entire lives into a single backpack. How to say goodbye without crying. And how to stop waiting for someone who never comes. Abigail had lived in 7 different foster homes since she was 4 years old. Some families were kind. Others simply offered a roof until it was time for her to move again. After a while, she stopped asking how long she would be staying. The morning she aged out of the system, a social worker handed her a folder, wished her good luck, and quietly closed the door behind her. There was no family waiting outside. No hugs. No one calling her name. Just a chilly October morning. A faded blue backpack and $87 tucked safely inside her jacket. For the next 2 weeks, Abigail drifted through the city unnoticed. She filled out job applications that were never answered. She spent afternoons in the public library because it was warm. At night, she rode the last city bus until it reached the final stop, then slept on a wooden bench in the station until security asked her to move along. One rainy evening, she walked past a little pizza shop just as a young girl ran into her father's arms. Abigail smiled without meaning to. It wasn't the food she envied. It was knowing someone was waiting for you. By the second Thursday, she had only $11 left. She was sitting outside a coffee shop, wondering whether to spend it on dinner or save it for tomorrow, when her phone rang. The number meant nothing to her. "Is this Abigail Munder?" "Yes." "My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm an attorney." There was a brief pause. "I'm calling because your uncle, Robert Foster, passed away 3 weeks ago." Abigail frowned. "I think you've made a mistake. I don't have an uncle." The attorney's voice grew quieter. "I believe that's what you've been told." Everything around her seemed to disappear. "We've been searching for you for months," he continued. "Mister? Foster named you as his only heir?" She stared across the street, unable to speak. "My parents died when I was 4. "Yes? And I don't have any family." Another pause. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Miss Foster, according to your uncle's final wishes, you were never as alone as you believed." The attorney explained that Robert had left her an old lakeside cottage in northern Wisconsin. Nothing grand. Just the cottage. Everything inside it. And one sealed letter that could only be opened after she arrived. That night, Abigail barely slept. Not because she was thinking about an inheritance, but because of a single question that wouldn't leave her heart. If someone had cared about her all these years, why had they never come? The next morning, she spent almost every dollar she had on a one-way bus ticket. As the city faded behind endless pine trees and quiet country roads, Abigail rested her forehead against the window. She believed she was traveling to a forgotten cottage left behind by a stranger. She had no idea that behind its weathered front door waited a story that would change everything she believed about love, family, and the life she thought no one had wanted. By the time Abigail Foster stepped off the bus, the afternoon sky had already begun to fade into soft shades of gray. The little lakeside town was quieter than she had imagined. A few brick storefronts lined the main street. An old diner sat on the corner beneath a weathered sign that looked as though it had been there for half a century. Beyond it, the road curved toward the lake, where tall pine trees swayed gently in the cool autumn breeze. A local taxi driver took her the last few miles. When he stopped, he pointed toward a narrow gravel driveway disappearing between the trees. "That'll be the Foster place," he said. Abigail followed his finger. The cottage stood alone near the shoreline. Its white paint had faded with age. The porch leaned ever so slightly to one side, and golden leaves covered the front steps as though no one had walked there in weeks. "This belonged to my uncle?" she asked quietly. The driver nodded. Robert Foster was a good man. He paused before continuing. Quiet fellow, kept mostly to himself, but if someone in this town needed help, Robert was usually the first one to show up. Abigail looked back at the cottage. She wanted to ask more questions. Instead, she thanked the driver, picked up her backpack, and watched the taxi disappear down the road. For a long moment, she simply stood there. The air smelled of pine needles, damp earth, and fresh lake water. It should have felt lonely. Instead, it felt strangely peaceful, almost as if the cottage had been waiting for her. She unlocked the front door with the key Mr. Mercer had given her. The hinges creaked softly. Inside, everything was spotless. Not expensive, not modern. Just loved. A folded blanket rested neatly over the old sofa. Reading glasses sat beside a worn armchair facing the stone fireplace. A coffee mug rested on a side table with a bookmark tucked inside an unfinished novel. Nothing felt abandoned. It felt as though the owner had simply stepped outside and forgotten to come back. Abigail walked slowly through the house. She ran her fingers across the kitchen counter. No dust, no cobwebs. Someone had been taking care of this place. She opened the refrigerator. It was empty except for a handwritten note held in place by a small lighthouse magnet. Fresh groceries every Friday. Don't forget the milk. Margaret. Abigail frowned. Who was Margaret? Before she could think about it, something beside the pantry caught her attention. A wooden board stood against the wall. It was a children's growth chart. Small pencil marks climbed higher and higher through the years. Age 5, age 7, age 9, age 12. She smiled sadly. Someone else's family memories. Then her eyes stopped. Near the top of the board, written in careful handwriting, was a single name. Abigail. Her breath caught. She stepped closer. There was no mistake. The name was hers. She touched the faded pencil mark with trembling fingers. How could that be? She had never been here before. Had she? Her mind searched desperately for a memory. Nothing. Only silence. She walked through the rest of the cottage almost without thinking. The bedroom overlooked the lake. A handmade quilt covered the bed. Inside the closet hung 3 flannel shirts, an old winter coat, and a fishing hat worn smooth with time. Robert Foster had clearly lived a simple life. The attorney had mentioned a letter. After nearly an hour of searching, Abigail finally spotted it resting on the mantel above the fireplace. A cream-colored envelope, her name written carefully across the front. For Abigail. Her heart began to race. She remembered Mr. Mercer's instructions. Wait until you arrive. She had arrived. Slowly. She opened the envelope. Inside was only 1 page. No explanation. No long farewell. Just a few lines written in neat handwriting. Dear Abigail, if you're reading this, then I'm sorry I never found the chance to tell you these things myself. There are answers inside this house. Please don't rush to find them. Some stories are meant to unfold one page at a time. Tomorrow morning, someone will knock on your door. Please trust her. She kept a promise when I no longer could. Uncle Robert." That was all. Abigail read the letter again. And again. She had hoped for answers. Instead, she had been given another mystery. Who was Margaret? What promise had she kept? And why had Robert never come to find her? As evening settled over the lake, Abigail built a small fire in the stone fireplace using the neatly stacked firewood beside it. Someone had prepared enough wood for an entire winter. Someone had expected this house to be lived in. She lowered herself into the old armchair and watched the flames dance across the room. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't wondering where she would sleep that night. Her eyes wandered across the bookshelves. There were fishing guides, old novels, family albums, and dozens of framed photographs. Most showed Robert standing beside neighbors at church picnics, fishing tournaments, and community events. Then one photograph caught her attention. It showed Robert standing outside the county fair. Several yards behind him, barely visible in the crowd, stood a little girl holding a blue balloon. Abigail's heart skipped. She recognized the jacket immediately. She had worn it when she was 9 years old. Her hands began to shake. She looked closer. Robert wasn't smiling at the camera. He wasn't even looking toward the photographer. He was looking at her. A chill ran down her spine. How many times had he been there? How many birthdays? Osh, thou. How many school events? How many ordinary afternoons had he quietly watched from a distance while she never even knew his name? Tears filled her eyes. Just then, 3 gentle knocks echoed through the cottage. Slow, steady, exactly as Robert's letter had promised. Abigail turned toward the front door. Someone was waiting outside, and somehow they already knew she had finally come home. The knock wasn't loud, just 3 slow, gentle taps against the old wooden door. Abigail remained frozen beside the fireplace, Robert's letter still resting in her trembling hands. For a brief moment, she wondered if she had imagined it. Then came another knock. Not impatient, not demanding, almost familiar. She walked to the door and opened it. Standing on the porch was an elderly woman wrapped in a long wool coat, a knitted scarf tucked neatly beneath her chin. Wisps of silver hair escaped from beneath her hat, and her kind blue eyes seemed to recognize Abigail before a single word had been spoken. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then the woman smiled through tears. "So," she whispered, "you finally made it." Abigail blinked. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" The woman shook her head. "No, but I've known about you for almost your entire life." She held out a small casserole dish wrapped in a kitchen towel. "My name is Margaret Wilson. I'm your Uncle Robert's neighbor, and his oldest friend." Abigail stepped aside. "Please, come in." Margaret paused just inside the doorway. Her eyes drifted slowly around the cottage. Everything remained exactly where Robert had left it. The armchair, the bookshelf, the fireplace. Even his old fishing hat still hung beside the door. She smiled sadly. He always said this house never truly belonged to him. Abigail frowned. What did he mean? Margaret looked toward the fire before answering. He believed he was simply taking care of it. Until you came home. The words settled heavily between them. Home. No one had ever used that word when speaking to Abigail. Margaret placed the casserole on the kitchen counter. "I figured you probably hadn't eaten much today." Abigail laughed softly. "I guess I'm not very good at hiding that." "My dear." Margaret smiled. Robert worried about whether you'd eaten enough almost every single day. Abigail looked up sharply. What? Margaret's smile faded. I suppose it's time you started hearing the truth. They settled into the 2 chairs beside the fireplace. For a while, Margaret simply watched the flames. It all began after your parents' accident, she said quietly. Robert blamed himself. Abigail's heart tightened. My attorney said he tried to find me. Margaret nodded. He did much more than try. She folded her hands in her lap. The day after your parents were buried, Robert drove straight to the county office. He told them he wanted to bring you home, but they refused. Why? He was 33, single, working 2 jobs. They told him a little girl needed stability. Margaret's voice cracked slightly. So he worked harder. He sold his truck, took night shifts, stopped buying anything for himself. He believed if he could just prove he was financially secure, they'd change their minds. They never did. Abigail lowered her eyes. He stopped trying. Margaret looked at her with gentle disappointment. Oh, sweetheart. He never stopped. She stood and walked toward an old cabinet, opening the bottom drawer. She carefully lifted out a worn cardboard box. I think Robert hoped you'd find these later, but perhaps now is the right time. Inside were dozens of neatly tied bundles of envelopes. Each one carried a year written across the front. Age 5, age 6, age 7, on and on. Until age 19. Abigail stared without breathing. But what are these letters? Margaret answered quietly. Every birthday, every Christmas, every time something important happened, he wrote to you. He simply had nowhere to send them. With trembling hands, Abigail untied the oldest bundle. Inside was a child's birthday card. The handwriting was careful, almost hesitant. Happy 5th birthday, Abigail. I bought you a little stuffed bear today. I don't know if you'll ever receive it, but I hope someone hugs you as tightly as I wish I could. Love, Uncle Robert. A tear slipped onto the paper. Then another. She quickly reached for the next letter. Christmas, age 7. I drove past your foster home today. You were building a snowman. You looked happy. I almost walked over. I almost told you who I was, but I was afraid I'd only make leaving harder. Forgive me. Love, Uncle Robert. Abigail covered her mouth. He saw me. Margaret nodded. Many times. He attended your elementary school music recital. He watched your middle school graduation from the last row. He sat in the parking lot after your high school ceremony, but he never interrupted your life. Why? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Because every lawyer he spoke to gave him the same advice. If he appeared without permission, he might lose every chance of ever reaching you legally. So he waited. He believed once you became an adult, he could finally tell you everything. Silence filled the room. Only the crackling fire could be heard. Abigail wiped her eyes. He was waiting. Margaret nodded. For 19 years. Then her smile slowly disappeared. But life doesn't always wait for us. She looked toward Robert's empty chair. He suffered a heart attack just 3 weeks before your 19th birthday. Abigail closed her eyes. So close. So very close. Margaret reached into the box once more. There was one thing he asked me to give you. She removed a small brass pocket watch. The metal had grown dull with age. Inside the lid was a tiny photograph. A 4-year-old girl laughing into the camera. Abigail, he carried this every day, Margaret whispered. He used to take it out whenever he thought no one was looking. Abigail turned the watch over in her hands. On the back were 6 simple words. Until she knows she's loved. Her tears finally came without restraint. For 19 years, she had believed no one remembered her. No one searched for her. No one wanted her. Yet somewhere, only a few hundred miles away, one quiet man had spent nearly 2 decades building a future for the little girl he could never bring home. Margaret gently placed her hand over Abigail's. "Robert left you much more than this cottage." Abigail looked up through blurred eyes. "What do you mean?" Margaret hesitated. Her gaze drifted toward the stone fireplace. "There are things about this house that Robert wanted you to discover only after you understood why he kept it." Abigail instinctively followed Margaret's eyes. The fire crackled softly. For just a second, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. One of the hearthstones sat ever so slightly higher than the others. And somehow, she knew Robert had meant for her to notice it. For a long moment, neither Abigail nor Margaret spoke. The fire crackled softly inside the stone fireplace, filling the room with a warmth Abigail hadn't felt in years. Yet her eyes remained fixed on the slightly uneven hearthstone beneath the flames. Margaret noticed. "So," she said gently, "you see it too." Abigail nodded. "It doesn't look like it belongs there." Margaret smiled faintly. Robert built this fireplace himself nearly 25 years ago. He measured everything twice. If one stone sits differently, it was never an accident. Abigail slowly knelt on the worn wooden floor. The stone looked almost identical to the others, except for one tiny corner that had been smoothed by countless hands over the years. She reached toward it, then stopped. "What if I'm not supposed to?" Margaret looked at her kindly. "Oh, sweetheart, I think he spent the last 19 years hoping you would." With careful fingers, Abigail pressed against the edge. Nothing happened. She pressed harder. The stone shifted. Her heartbeat quickened. Together, they lifted it away. Beneath the hearth was a narrow compartment carved into the foundation. Inside rested a weathered metal box. Unlike something hidden out of fear, the box looked as though it had been placed there with extraordinary care. Margaret quietly stepped back. "This belongs to you." Abigail hesitated before lifting it into her lap. It was surprisingly heavy. Her fingers trembled as she unlatched the lid. Inside lay stacks of neatly organized documents. Bank statements, investment records, property deeds, everything tied together with faded blue ribbons. But Abigail barely noticed them. Resting on top was another envelope. This one was different. Across the front, in Robert's familiar handwriting, were 6 simple words. I read this before anything else. Abigail carefully unfolded the letter. "Dear Abigail, if you found this box, then you've already learned enough to know I loved you. Before you look at the papers beneath this letter, there's something far more important I need you to understand. Money can change where a person lives. It cannot change who they become. If all I leave behind is money, then I have failed you. What I truly hope to leave you is the confidence to believe that your life has always mattered. Because it has, every single day." Abigail stopped reading. Her vision blurred. No one had ever written words like that to her. Not once. Margaret quietly handed her a handkerchief. "He rewrote that letter 3 times, she whispered. "I know. I watched him throw the first 2 into the fire." Abigail smiled through tears. "He wanted to get it right." Margaret nodded. "He always believed some words deserved patience." After a few quiet moments, Abigail reached beneath the letter and lifted the first financial statement. She frowned. The numbers didn't make sense. She looked again. Then a third time. Millions of dollars. Not hundreds. Not thousands. Millions. Carefully invested over decades. She stared in disbelief. This can't be real. It is, Margaret replied softly. Robert started with almost nothing. He worked as a carpenter. Then he repaired boats. Sometimes 3 jobs at once. He lived simply. He invested every extra dollar. But not because he wanted to become wealthy. Abigail looked up. Then why? Margaret smiled sadly. Because he believed that one day you would need choices. Those words settled deep inside Abigail. Choices. She had spent her entire life surviving, choosing between food and bus fare, between pride and asking for help, between another shelter or another cold night outside. No one had ever imagined a future where she would have choices, except Robert. As she continued sorting through the papers, another notebook appeared beneath the investment records. Its leather cover had softened with age. Robert's handwriting covered the first page. Private journal. Abigail opened it carefully. The first entries described investment decisions, repair jobs, weather, fishing trips. Nothing remarkable. Then the tone changed. Today, I drove 3 hours just to watch Abigail's school concert. She never saw me. She smiled when she sang. For 5 minutes, I forgot how much I missed her. Abigail swallowed hard. Another page. Her foster mother hugged her after graduation. I thanked God someone was there. I only wish it could have been me. Another. Sometimes I wonder if she'll hate me. If she does, I'll understand. She'll never know how many mistakes I made trying to reach her. Abigail closed the notebook. For years, she had believed she had been forgotten. Now, she realized something far more painful. She had been loved by a man carrying more regret than she could imagine. Margaret spoke quietly. Robert wasn't a perfect man. Abigail looked toward her. He blamed himself for almost everything. There were years he worked so much trying to build a future for you that he forgot to live one for himself. He always thought there would be more time. The room fell silent again. How often, Abigail wondered, had people made the same mistake? Waiting 1 more year, 1 more promotion, 1 more milestone. Believing love could always be expressed tomorrow. She looked around the little cottage, the worn furniture, the handmade shelves, the old fishing rod standing in the corner. Everything suddenly looked different. She had arrived believing she had inherited a house. Now she understood. She had inherited an entire lifetime of quiet sacrifices. As the afternoon sunlight faded across the lake, Abigail carried the metal box back to the hidden compartment. Margaret looked surprised. "You're putting it back?" Abigail nodded. "For now." Why, she rested one hand gently on the hearthstone. "Because I don't think Robert wanted me to discover the money first. I think he wanted me to discover him." Margaret smiled, tears filling her eyes. "I believe you're right." As Abigail carefully slid the stone back into place, she noticed something she had overlooked before. Folded beneath the compartment was a yellowed county survey map. Only one corner remained visible. Across the top, in Robert's handwriting, someone had written, "When they come asking for the land, read this first." Abigail frowned. Margaret's gentle smile slowly disappeared. She looked toward the front window. "They've been waiting a long time." Before Abigail could ask another question, the distant sound of tires crunching across gravel echoed outside. Both women turned toward the window. A black SUV was slowly making its way up the long driveway. Margaret's face grew pale. "They're here sooner than I expected." Abigail looked back toward the hidden compartment beneath the fireplace. For the first time, she realized Robert hadn't spent 19 years protecting money. He had been protecting something far more valuable, and whoever had just arrived already knew exactly where to find it. The black SUV rolled to a slow stop in front of the cottage. For a few seconds, no one stepped out. Abigail stood near the fireplace, her pulse quickening, while Margaret quietly pulled the curtains together just enough to see without being seen. "They found us faster than I expected," Margaret murmured. "Who are they?" Abigail whispered. Margaret let out a long breath. "People with very deep pockets and very little patience." The driver's door opened. A tall man in his early 50s stepped onto the gravel driveway. He wore a tailored charcoal overcoat and carried a leather portfolio under one arm. His silver hair was neatly combed, and there wasn't a wrinkle on his polished shoes. He looked more like a banker than someone visiting an old lakeside cottage. He walked calmly to the porch and knocked. 3 firm knocks. Nothing like Margaret's gentle greeting. Abigail glanced toward her. Margaret simply nodded. "You'll have to face this sooner or later." Abigail opened the door. The man offered a courteous smile. "Miss Foster." "Yes." "My name is Nathan Caldwell. I represent Evergreen Development Group." He extended his hand. Abigail hesitated before shaking it. "I'm very sorry for the loss of your uncle." His sympathy sounded practiced, polished, almost rehearsed. "Thank you." "I won't take much of your time," Nathan continued. "I understand you've only just arrived." His eyes briefly wandered past Abigail's shoulder, studying the inside of the cottage before returning to her. "We're interested in purchasing this property." Abigail blinked. This quickly, he smiled politely. "We've admired this stretch of shoreline for years." Margaret folded her arms. "You've been trying to buy it for years." Nathan acknowledged her with a respectful nod. "Mrs. Wilson, I wasn't aware you were here. I imagine there are many things you weren't aware of." For the first time, the smile on Nathan's face weakened. He reached into his portfolio and removed a folder. "We're prepared to make an exceptionally generous offer." He placed the folder in Abigail's hands. She opened it. The number printed across the first page stole her breath. It was more money than she had ever imagined. Enough to buy a home, pay for college, travel, never worry about rent again. For a brief moment, her mind returned to the cold nights at the bus station, to counting coins for dinner, to wondering whether she would survive another week. Nathan noticed the hesitation in her eyes. "I imagine this would change your life." He wasn't wrong. It would. Margaret remained silent. She knew this wasn't her decision. Nathan continued gently. "The cottage needs extensive repairs. The winters here are harsh. Living alone isn't easy. Our company would preserve your uncle's memory while allowing you to build a new future." Abigail looked down at the offer again. A week ago, she would have signed without reading another page. She had spent 19 years wishing for exactly this kind of miracle. Security, freedom, a fresh start. Then she remembered Robert's letter. Money can change where a person lives. It cannot change who they become. She slowly closed the folder. "My uncle refused to sell." Nathan nodded. "Several times." "Did he tell you why?" A flicker crossed Nathan's face. "Mr. Foster was deeply attached to the property." "That's not what I asked." For the first time, silence settled between them. Nathan carefully chose his next words. There were different opinions about the land's future. The land. "Yes?" Abigail noticed something. He barely mentioned the cottage. He kept talking about the land. Margaret noticed it too. "So," she said quietly, You're finally admitting it isn't the house you want. Nathan smiled politely. I'm afraid I don't understand. Oh, I think you do. His expression hardened ever so slightly. We believe this shoreline has tremendous economic potential. Margaret gave a soft laugh. Economic? What a tidy word. She turned toward Abigail. Your uncle had another word for it. What was that? Abigail asked. Responsibility? Nathan interrupted before Margaret could continue. I respect your uncle. I truly do. But times change. This community needs jobs. It needs investment. It needs progress. Margaret looked directly into his eyes. And what happens when progress destroys the very thing people came here to enjoy? Nathan didn't answer. Instead, he returned his attention to Abigail. You don't have to decide today, but I should mention, our investors won't wait forever. He slid a business card across the table. When you're ready, call me. He tipped his head politely before walking back toward the SUV. Halfway across the porch, he stopped. Without turning around, he said quietly, Your uncle spent a lifetime protecting this place. I hope you understand why. Then he left. The sound of tires faded down the gravel road. Silence returned to the lake. Abigail stood motionless, still holding the offer. Finally, she looked at Margaret. What didn't he tell me? Margaret walked to the fireplace and rested one hand on the stone Robert had hidden years before. Robert used to say something. What? Some people see land. Well, others see what the land keeps alive. Abigail slowly unfolded the old county survey map they had discovered earlier. For the first time, she studied it carefully. Colored markings covered the shoreline. Handwritten notes filled the margins. Most meant nothing to her, until one phrase caught her attention. Protected freshwater aquifer. She frowned. What does this mean? Margaret smiled sadly. It means your uncle wasn't protecting a piece of property. He was protecting something thousands of families will never even know exists. Abigail looked from the map to the lake, then back toward the empty road where Nathan's SUV had disappeared. Only hours earlier, she believed Robert had left her a house. Then she believed he had left her a fortune. Now she was beginning to understand the truth. Neither had ever been the real inheritance. Robert had left her something far heavier than money. He had left her a choice. For the first time in her life, Abigail Foster wasn't wondering how she was going to survive. She was wondering what kind of person she wanted to become. And somehow, that question felt far more valuable than everything hidden beneath the fireplace. That night, Abigail Foster didn't sleep very much. The old cottage was quiet, except for the gentle sound of waves brushing against the shore. Every so often, the wind would rattle the pine branches outside, and the fire would settle with a soft crackle. She sat alone in Robert's armchair, the county survey map spread across her lap. For the first time in her life, no one was telling her what to do. There was no caseworker, no foster parent, no social worker deciding where she would live next. The decision belonged to her, and somehow that frightened her more than anything else ever had. She looked toward the metal box resting once again beneath the hearthstone. Only yesterday, she would have believed that finding millions of dollars was the greatest miracle that could happen to someone like her. Now, it no longer felt like the biggest discovery in the house. Robert's love was. She reached for his journal once again. Near the back, tucked between financial records and handwritten notes, she found several pages folded neatly together. Across the top, Robert had written, "Things I hope Abigail learns before she needs them." Abigail smiled through tired eyes. The first page wasn't about money. It wasn't about investments. It wasn't about protecting land. Instead, it read, If you're afraid of asking questions, you'll spend your life accepting answers that belong to someone else. She read the sentence 3 times. How many times had she stayed silent simply because she was afraid of sounding foolish? Too many. She turned another page. Never be embarrassed by what you don't know. Be embarrassed only if you stop learning. Abigail slowly closed the journal. Robert hadn't spent 19 years preparing her to inherit a fortune. He had spent 19 years trying to prepare her to trust herself. The next morning, after Margaret arrived with fresh bread and hot coffee, Abigail made a decision. I need to understand what I'm protecting. Margaret smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. Instead of spending the morning inside the cottage, the 2 women drove into town. Their first stop wasn't a lawyer's office. It was the county library. Abigail looked puzzled. I thought we'd be meeting someone. Margaret smiled. We are. She pointed toward a gray-haired woman organizing old maps behind a large wooden desk. This is Helen Brooks. She knows more about this county than anyone alive. Helen welcomed them warmly. When Abigail explained that she had inherited Robert Foster's property, Helen's expression softened. Robert came here almost every Thursday. He checked old land records, environmental reports, historical surveys. He said someday his niece would need to understand this place. Abigail's throat tightened. He really believed I'd come. Helen smiled. He never doubted it. For the next several hours, Helen spread old maps across a long oak table. She explained how the underground aquifer stretched beneath the surrounding forest, how generations of families depended on wells connected to that water, how careless development could damage something that had taken thousands of years to form. Abigail listened carefully. At first, much of it sounded complicated. Legal terms, geological reports, environmental regulations. Only weeks earlier she would have given up. Now. She kept asking questions. What happens if the water becomes contaminated? Who protects it? Why wasn't this public information? Helen answered everyone patiently. Margaret watched quietly from across the room. Robert would have smiled, she thought. On the drive home, Margaret glanced toward Abigail. You're different already. Abigail laughed softly. I don't feel different. No. You asked more questions today than you probably asked during your entire childhood. Abigail thought about that. Margaret was right. Growing up in foster care had taught her something she had never questioned before. Don't make trouble. Don't ask too much. Don't give people a reason to send you somewhere else. She had carried those lessons into adulthood without even realizing it. Perhaps Robert had seen that. Perhaps that was why his journal contained page after page encouraging her to be curious. That afternoon another envelope arrived. No return address. Inside was a revised purchase offer from Evergreen Development Group. The amount was even higher than before. Attached was a short handwritten note. Everyone has a price. Abigail stared at the words for a long time. Then she smiled. Not because the offer tempted her. Because, for the first time in her life, someone had completely misunderstood her. A month ago, money would have solved every problem she had. Now she understood that some things became priceless the moment you understood why they mattered. She folded the letter neatly. Across the front of the envelope she wrote 5 simple words. Not everything is for sale. The next morning she mailed it back unopened. That evening, while placing another log on the fire, Abigail noticed Robert's pocket watch resting on the mantel. She picked it up. Inside was the tiny photograph of her at 4 years old. Beneath it, the familiar inscription, "Until she knows she's loved." For 19 years, that had been Robert's mission. He hadn't lived long enough to tell her in person. But somehow, he still had. Abigail looked around the little cottage. The loneliness she had carried since childhood hadn't disappeared overnight. She still missed the years they would never have together. She still grieved the conversations they would never share. But something inside her had changed. She no longer saw herself as the unwanted child who had drifted through 7 foster homes. She no longer measured her worth by who had left. Instead, she began measuring it by the man who had never stopped believing she mattered. Later that evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the lake, Margaret found Abigail sitting quietly on the porch. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Abigail smiled. "My whole life, I thought I was searching for a family." She looked across the calm water. "Now I realize, my family was searching for me." Margaret slipped her arm gently around the young woman's shoulders. And now, Abigail's eyes drifted toward the old cottage behind them. "Now, I think it's my turn to protect what he spent his whole life protecting." Margaret nodded slowly. "I believe Robert has been waiting a very long time to hear you say that." The lake rolled gently against the shore. The same water Robert had watched for decades. The same water generations would one day depend upon. And for the first time since stepping off that bus, Abigail Foster no longer felt like a young woman who had finally found an inheritance. She felt like someone who had finally found her place in the world. Winter arrived quietly that year. The first snow covered the shoreline almost overnight, softening the scars left by months of construction on neighboring properties. Half-finished docks stood frozen along the water like abandoned promises, while heavy machinery sat silent beneath white blankets of snow. But the little Foster cottage remained untouched, not because the pressure had disappeared, because Abigail had changed. The legal battles stretched on through the winter. Evergreen Development Group filed new proposals. They challenged environmental reports. They questioned property boundaries. They offered more money, then even more. Each offer was larger than the last. Months earlier, Abigail would have stared at those numbers in disbelief. Now she rarely looked beyond the first page. She had finally understood something Robert had spent a lifetime trying to teach her. The value of something isn't measured by the highest offer. It's measured by what would be lost if it disappeared. One snowy afternoon, Margaret arrived carrying a basket of homemade bread. "You've become the talk of the county," she said with a smile. Abigail laughed. "I was hoping to avoid that. I'm afraid it's too late." Margaret sat beside the fire and handed her a local newspaper. Across the front page was a photograph of Abigail standing beside the old cottage. The headline read, "Young woman refuses multi-million-dollar offer to protect local water source." Abigail sighed. "I didn't do this to become a story." "No," Margaret replied softly. "You did it because Robert raised you." She paused, smiling. "Even if he had to do it from a distance." Those words stayed with Abigail long after Margaret had gone home. That evening, she opened Robert's journal one final time. Near the back, tucked inside the last page, she found something she had somehow missed before. One final letter. The envelope had never been sealed. Across the front were the words, "Only after you've made your decision." Abigail unfolded the paper carefully. "Dear Abigail, if you've reached this letter, then you've already chosen your own path. And that matters more to me than which path you chose. If you sold the cottage, I hope it gave you peace. If you stayed, I hope it gave you purpose. Neither choice would ever disappoint me. There is only one thing I ask. Don't spend your life trying to become the person you think I wanted you to be. Become the person you were always meant to be. That will be more than enough. Love always. Uncle Robert." Abigail lowered the letter into her lap. For months, she had believed she was protecting Robert's dream. Now she realized something beautiful. He had never wanted to control her future. He had only wanted her to know she finally had one. A few weeks later, the County Conservation Board held its final public hearing. The meeting room was packed. Residents filled every seat. Some came because they supported the project. Others came because they feared losing future jobs. Abigail wasn't the oldest person in the room. She wasn't the wealthiest. She wasn't the most experienced. But when her turn came to speak, the room became silent. She stood slowly, holding Robert's pocket watch in one hand. "My uncle spent years protecting this land," she began. "But not because he wanted to own it." She looked around the room. "He believed some things don't belong to one person. They belong to everyone who comes after us." She paused. "I grew up believing I had been left behind. But this place taught me something different. The greatest inheritance isn't money. It's knowing someone believed your life was worth preparing for." Many people wiped away tears. Even those who disagreed with her proposal listened quietly. When the vote was finally announced, the conservation easement passed. The shoreline would remain permanently protected. The aquifer beneath it would never be disturbed. Outside the courthouse, reporters hurried toward Abigail. "What are you going to do with the money your uncle left you?" She smiled. "The same thing he spent his whole life doing. I'm going to invest in people." Within a year, the old cottage looked different. The peeling paint had been restored. The porch had been rebuilt. But the heart of the house remained exactly the same. The room where Robert once sat writing letters became a small reading room. The spare bedroom welcomed young adults who had recently aged out of foster care and needed a safe place to begin again. A wooden sign now stood beside the driveway. The Robert Foster House. A place where new beginnings find a home. Abigail personally greeted every young person who arrived. She never began by asking where they had come from. She asked something much simpler: "Have you eaten today?" Because she remembered what it felt like when no one asked. One spring afternoon, nearly a year after she first arrived, Abigail stood on the porch watching the lake shimmer beneath the afternoon sun. Children laughed near the shoreline. Neighbors waved as they passed. The cottage no longer felt like an inheritance. It felt like a promise that had finally been fulfilled. Margaret walked up the porch steps carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Robert would be proud," she said quietly. Abigail smiled. "I hope so." Margaret looked toward the water. "I think you're wrong." Abigail raised an eyebrow. "Oh, he isn't proud because you protected his cottage." She gently squeezed Abigail's hand. "He's proud because you became the family someone else will remember for the rest of their life." Abigail looked toward the front door. A young man who had recently left foster care was helping another resident repair a broken fence. Inside, someone was laughing. Someone else was baking bread. The house was alive again. Not because Robert had left behind money, because he had left behind love. As the evening sun painted the lake in shades of gold, Abigail slipped Robert's pocket watch into her coat pocket one last time. She no longer carried it to remind herself of what she had lost. She carried it to remind herself of what she had found. A family she never knew she had, a purpose she never imagined she would discover, and the quiet truth that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Sometimes the people who love us most never have the chance to say it out loud. But if we're willing to look closely, we may discover they've been loving us all along. A year passed. The little lakeside cottage was no longer just an old house hidden among the pine trees. It had become Robert Foster House, a place where young adults leaving foster care could find something many of them had never known before. A safe place to begin again. One quiet afternoon, while cleaning Robert's old desk, Abigail discovered a final envelope hidden beneath a loose drawer. Across the front, in Robert's familiar handwriting, were 4 simple words: "For whoever comes next." Inside was one last letter. If you're reading this, then Abigail kept her promise. That means this house has become exactly what I hoped it would. A place where no young person has to begin adulthood alone. If life has brought you here, remember this. The greatest thing we can leave behind isn't money. It's making sure someone else feels loved after we're gone. Welcome home. Robert Foster. Abigail quietly folded the letter and placed it beside Robert's pocket watch. For a long moment, she simply smiled. His work wasn't over. It was living on through her. A few weeks later, an old county bus stopped outside the cottage. An 18-year-old girl stepped off carrying a worn backpack. She stood at the edge of the driveway, uncertain whether she belonged there. Abigail walked onto the porch. For just a second, she saw herself exactly 1 year earlier, alone, afraid, certain no one was waiting. She smiled warmly and walked toward the young woman. "I'm sorry," the girl whispered. "I was told this place helps people who don't have a home." Abigail gently took the backpack from her shoulder. Then she said the words she had spent her own childhood longing to hear. "We've been expecting you." The young woman's eyes filled with tears. "I don't have any family." Abigail smiled. "You do now." As the front door closed behind them, Margaret watched quietly from her garden. She looked toward the lake and smiled to herself. Robert Foster had wanted to save one little girl. Instead, his love had become a home for many. And perhaps that's the greatest legacy any of us can leave behind. Not the wealth we collect, not the house we own, but the life we change. So before you leave today, I'd like to ask you one simple question. If someone remembered you 20 years from now,